Welcome again. My name is Belinda Ayanga. I'm Communications Manager here at ACET. Today we're having our second African Transformation Briefing, which is one of the ways that ACET is using to really deepen our relationships with our media colleagues and really provide a platform for journalists who report on African issues, African transformation issues, to gain a better understanding of the issues and also to be able to share the knowledge and expertise that ACET has. Today, we are going to be talking about an equally important issue, climate change, which is very topical for Africa, especially as we host the next COP27 in Egypt in November. So our expert, Professor John Asafu-Adjaye, who works with ACET as Senior Fellow, will be taking us through some of the highlights and the trending and important issues for Africa as far as climate change is concerned as we head into COP. Once again, off to Professor Asafu-Adjaye to go through his presentation, after which we will open the floor for discussions.
Thank you, Belinda, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be talking to you this afternoon about climate change. COP27 is only a few months away, but it's not getting much traction given all that is happening around the world. But I think now is the time to really be talking about it in terms of what Africa wants from COP. So this afternoon, I'll be talking about how Africa can leverage COP to address the climate issues that we face. So I'll start off with some introductory remarks where I will talk about what has happened over the last 2 years. Then I'll start talking about climate finance, which will be at the top of Africa's agenda come November. I'll talk about how climate finance has failed Africa. What are some of the challenges that Africa faces in accessing climate finance, and what needs to change to really improve things. I'll also present some evidence on the cost of inaction on climate finance. COP26 actually started laying the blocks for the advent of carbon trading, and I expect that there'll be more information at COP27 in terms of the timelines. So here I'd like to talk about what Africa needs to do to benefit from carbon trading. The transition to low carbon economics will have some challenges for Africa, but there are also some opportunities. So I'll look at some of these, including innovative ways of generating carbon credits. And then I'll just finish with the summary and recommendations. I'm planning not to talk for more than 20 minutes. So Belinda, do give me a shout if I appear to be spending too much time. So let me get started. The past 2 years have been very difficult for Africa, and indeed for many regions of the world, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the havoc that it's wreaked on African economies and other economies. The beginning of 2022 saw some evidence of a rebound from the devastations of the pandemic. Global supply chains, as you know, have been severely disrupted over the past 2 years, and it was starting to recover to some extent. But very early in the year, we were then hit by the Russia-Ukraine war, which has resulted in further disruption of the global supply chains. And in fact, this is one of the reasons for the rapidly rising inflation that we are seeing around the world. But at the same time, there are ongoing climate-related events. And I'd just like to give a few examples of what has happened. So starting in 2020, parts of Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi were hit by tropical cyclone Idai, which was closely followed by Cyclone Kenneth. About 3 million people were badly affected, and in fact, some 600 people lost their lives as a result of these disasters. This year, the area has been hit again by Cyclone Eloise, and this is causing severe flooding and more death. And here in Accra, We've experienced a lot of flooding over the last few months due to heavy rainfall that we've witnessed this year. So the problem is that Africa has contributed to only 3.8% of total global emissions, but we are bearing the brunt of climate change. It's estimated that Africa loses between $7 and $15 billion per annum due to climate change. And this figure is expected to rise to about 50 billion by 2040. In fact, the recent figures from UNECA shows that some African countries are spending as much as 5% of their GDP to address the impacts of these natural disasters. And this is without any climate finance. So this money is coming from their budgets. And so you can see that Africa's situation is quite dire, and it's likely that it's going to get worse. So with COP27 coming on at Sharm el-Sheikh in November, this is really a good opportunity for Africa to state its case on climate. We haven't yet officially seen Africa's position, although we've spoken to some members of the AU and some people who are closely connected to the Africa Group of Negotiators, the AGN. And so climate finance is still going to be at the top of the agenda. And I believe that there will also be some demands around the energy transition. So those are the two topics that I'd like to focus on today. So starting with climate finance, I would like to show a graph which shows the trends in the share of total global finance. And you can see that this whole idea of providing finance to developing countries actually came up at COP15 in 2009, when the advanced countries pledged to mobilize $100 billion per annum by 2020 as to help developing countries undertake mitigation and adaptation. Now, we know that this has not materialized. So I have some figures showing the trends in the finance that has gone to Africa and other parts of the world. So between 2010 and 2015, a total of $212 billion was disbursed as climate finance. 81 billion of this went to Asia, and $48 billion, which is about 23%, went to Africa, as the graph on my left shows. Now, there has been an increase in this finance. So, for example, between 2016 and 2019, Africa received about $73 billion in climate finance. You can see that it was an improvement over the 2010-2015 amount. But actually, it's not that much. It's actually a mere 3% increase. So even though it's an improvement, you can see that it's well below the 100 billion that was promised. So what we can say is that the finance that Africa has received falls far short of the needs that of African countries. And so this graph I'm showing is the estimates of the annual climate needs in Africa for adaptation, mitigation, and what we call loss and damage. So the graph on the left-hand side shows the adaptation estimates that between 2020 and 2030, Africa will need between $259 billion and $407 billion. If you break this down into annual needs, it comes down to about $26 to $41 billion per annum that we need for adaptation. For mitigation, the amount is $715 billion over the same period, which comes down to $72 billion annually. And then for loss and damage, which is to do with all these natural disasters, it's estimated that we will need between 289 to 441 billion, which then comes to 29 to 44 billion dollars per annum. So clearly, you can see that what we've received is nowhere near what we need to actually address climate change. So the graph that I'm showing now shows the share of annual climate finance for adaptation, mitigation, and other purposes. And you can see that roughly about 48% goes to mitigation, which is this area. And that has been the emphasis of most of the climate finance. In fact, in the case of Africa, only 41% goes to adaptation. Now, most of these funds for mitigation goes to renewable energy project development. And whilst that is an opportunity to actually transform African economies, the AGN has actually asked for a 50-50 split between mitigation and adaptation. The other thing that I also want to show is that when it comes to adaptation, a lot of the money that's given is in the form of loans rather than grants. So a recent study showed that a study over the period 2014-2018 indicated that 42% of the funds were provided as grants, and the majority, which is almost 57%, close to 60%, was in the form of debt instruments. Now, this, as you can see, creates a lot of problems for African countries, many of which are struggling with debt. And so once again, it sort of makes it difficult for them to address the issue of climate change. All right, so let me inflate a few more statistics on you. And so now I would like to look at disbursements versus actual amounts mobilized on the ground. Most times, the pledges that countries make does not match the actual disbursement on the ground. So the graph that I'm showing you shows you the ratio of actual disbursements to commitments, which is the promises. And in the case of Africa, this is over the period 2014 to 2018. And in the case of Africa, you can see that mitigation and adaptation received about 56% and 46% respectively. Again, just for comparison, you can see that what Africa receives is far less than the global average, which again goes to drive home the point that Africa is being underfunded in terms of climate finance. So far, and I've got more evidence, but due to lack of time, I'll just skip that. But the point I want to make here is that the data actually supports the AGN's position that inadequate climate finance is being mobilized for Africa to support climate change, especially when it comes to adaptation. So again, this is why climate finance will be important for Africa come November this year. What's responsible for this low flow of finance? Well, there are factors which are divided on the part of African countries and also on the part of the funders. So on the part of African countries, the major problem that we face is really lack of technical expertise to formulate project proposals to these climate funds. Now, these are very, very technical endeavors, and most countries do not have the capacity or expertise. And in fact, a lot of developing countries have to rely on the multilateral development banks to even put forward these climate proposals. The other problem is that when proposals are put through, a lot of them are really not bankable. Some of them may have good intentions or may be well-deserved, but in terms of bankable projects, they do not meet the requirements of the climate funders. Part of the problem is the challenge of data. And this data relates to agriculture, forestry, land uses, and also other industrial sectors, which is needed to show how much carbon emissions can be reduced from any adaptation and mitigation action. Again, this is very technical, and most countries do not have the expertise to generate this kind of data. Other factors include lack of project management skills, poor programming capacity on the part of government departments, and in the case of renewable energy, there's lack of experience in managing large-scale projects, which actually makes it very difficult to apply for sufficient funds for either mitigation or for adaptation. On the part of the funders, there are a number of factors too, which make it hard for African countries to apply for finance. One of them is co-finance. A lot of the climate funds require co-financing. And as I've said before, countries face financial challenges. And so again, they do not have the resources. There's no support for developing concept notes. And the process itself for many of these funds tends to be very long and protracted with very long timelines. Often there's lack of flexibility in the whole process, and this can lead to lots of delays. So from this point, you can see that the financial architecture of the global climate funds needs to change for it to be able to meet the demands of developing countries, especially African countries. Let me come to the cost of inaction on climate finance. Now, climate finance, as I said, has not met its the level of need, and in the meantime, it's causing a lot of adverse impacts. Let me first look at the issue of food security. What is happening with all the impacts of extreme events is leading to a worsening of food security. So, for example, in 2020, FAO estimated that 1 in 5 Africans goes hungry. This is roughly about 250 million people, or about 90% of the people on the continent. And I should say that these figures would have gone up since 2020 if you add on the natural disasters that have occurred, and if you add on the Russian-Ukraine war, which has clearly exacerbated the position. The projections are that the numbers could reach and exceed 840 million by 2030 if nothing is done about the situation. Another way of looking at the cost of inaction is to look at the foregone benefits of improved energy access. So, for example, if we were to provide clean cooking solutions to African households, this could save around approximately 300,000 children dying annually from acute respiratory tract infections, because most of African households use biomass for for cooking and also for light, and of course there's air pollution coming from these sources of cooking. Quite apart from the fact that it's leading to high levels of deforestation on the continent. We can also look at the effect of climate finance in terms of the worsening living standards on the continent. So here I refer to one study which predicts that by 2067 or thereabouts, the cost of climate change to African countries will be a loss of GDP of between 2 to 5% on average. But actually, if you look at individual countries, this ranges from about 70% per year in Ivory Coast to almost 90% in Mozambique and 7% in Kenya. So therefore, you can see that the cost of inaction could be very, very severe on African countries. Let me talk about the energy transition now, because COP26 reached agreement on Article 6 of the 2015 Paris Agreement. So this paves the way for the establishment of global trading on carbon markets. And this actually brings opportunities, but there are also challenges. And I'll speak about some of these. So with its massive renewable energy resources and carbon stocks, you can see that carbon finance, carbon trading could provide an additional source of finance. One estimate by UNECA puts it that if at a global carbon price of $50 per ton, Africa could mobilize about $30 billion annually. And this is additional finance which is coming from just trading alone. Unfortunately, Africa has very little experience of trading on carbon markets. And it accounts for about only 2% of trading on the international carbon markets. And most of this is being undertaken in South Africa and a few countries in North Africa. Let me just point out that carbon trading will also become important for Africa, especially with its trade with the EU. So you've probably heard that the EU has implemented what it calls the carbon border adjustment, which is due to start in January 2023. So the CBAM, as they call it, basically will apply a carbon price at the border to imports of carbon-intensive products. The idea that EU wants to achieve, or the goal that EU wants to achieve, is actually to prevent what they call carbon leakage in non-EU countries, and also to encourage trading partners to implement carbon trading policies to fight climate change. So therefore, it means that Africa will need to put its house in order that the CBAM will not be a constraint to exports to the EU. So what does Africa need to do to benefit from carbon trading? Well, there are a few things that Africa can do. As I've said, one is, most importantly, is that Africa needs to build its capacity to be an equal player on the international market. So there's a lot of need for capacity building. Also, the current situation with the trading on carbon markets is that there are constraints or barriers to African countries and other developing countries. And COP27 and subsequent meetings will need to address these barriers. One of them is the high brokerage fee, which is some of the brokers take as much as 50% of earnings. And there are also expenses to be verification of carbon stocks is also quite expensive and can be a constraint to African countries. Another issue that needs to be addressed is the high price differentials that exist between carbon prices in Africa vis-a-vis other regions. So for example, carbon is priced less than $5 per ton in Africa, and this compares to about $129 for the EU and about $125 in the EU in the US. So the point is that why is the market responding differently to Africa's carbon? And so that's an issue that needs to be addressed. And we also need to address the issue of technical assistance and technology transfer to help us assess our carbon stocks, which can then be verified for us to participate in these markets. Also, the transition into low carbon and zero carbon will be costly for Africa. So that's one of the issues. But there are also opportunities for job creation. So a study done by McKinsey estimates that a net zero transition will create about 200 million jobs, but 185 million direct jobs and indirect jobs will be lost, right? So though there's going to be a net job creation, you can see that jobs will be lost in some sectors. And actually, some work that we've recently done also confirms that. Also, the cost to Africa will be more. They estimate that Africa will need to invest about 1.5 times or more of their GDP compared to the rich countries to support economic development and also to build low carbon infrastructure. But on the plus side, Africa's massive renewable energy resources and also its young labor force can be leveraged for job creation. So here I would like to show you some estimates that were put forth by a group of a network that's working on the mitigation and job creation. And this has to do with what they refer to as nature-based carbon removal. So this is things like job planting, development of biochar, and nature-based practices. And they estimate that at a carbon price of $10 or less, these practices could create about 40 million jobs annually. If the carbon price were to go up to, let's say, $50 per ton or less, up to 86 million jobs can be created annually. So you can see that there's great potential for job creation in this area. And by the way, these estimates are actually conservative because it's only, they try to estimate only direct jobs, including upstream jobs. They do not include indirect jobs because of the difficulty of doing so. But you can, based on past experience, we know that for each direct job that is created, there are at least 2 or more indirect jobs that are created. So I mean, so the ratio is about 1 to 2 or 3 or more, so that there are multiple jobs. So you can see that the prospects are quite good, but all this will depend on 1, the price of carbon, and 2, it will depend on climate finance to enable countries to actually develop these practices and create jobs. The other thing I would also like to talk about is the issue of the just energy transition and what it means for Africa. Let me start by saying that Africa is fully committed to lowering global emissions, even though, as I've said, we are less responsible for the damage that's been done. But all 54 African countries have signed the Paris Agreement, and most of them have actually ratified their NDCs. And actually, I'm expecting that as of last year, October, 38 out of 54 countries have submitted updated NDCs. And for COP27, I'm expecting the number to go up in terms of the countries that have submitted updated NDCs. So the point is that we are committed to reducing carbon, but the point is that even though the price of renewable energy technologies keep declining, Africa cannot leapfrog overnight. And we, first of all, more than half of the population do not have access to electricity, and only 17% have access to clean cooking solutions. So when we talk about just energy transition, just on the part of increasing energy access, it means that we can't rely on renewables alone, and that we will need to combine renewables with natural gas to increase stability of power energy, as well as energy security, and also to improve the whole, access and affordability. So I believe that this will be a very important issue. As you know, the EU and the US last year at COP26 announced that they're not going to support the development of any fossil fuels, and gas falls in that category, because even though we know that gas is not as dirty as coal, it's still a fossil fuel, and therefore it means that countries that have recently discovered natural gas will face challenges in raising finance to exploit these natural resources. But the point is that even if Africa triples the use of gas to power, it's likely to contribute to less than 1% of total global carbon emissions. The other point I also like to add to this is that with the threat to gas and petrol, other resources from Russia going to the EU, a lot of the EU countries are now looking to local sources of developing their, closing the energy gap. And I believe that some of them will be considering the use of coal and other resources, which they have previously decided not to use. So this issue, Africa can actually point to this and say that, well, if you guys are going to look to their resources to meet your power needs, why don't we also have access to our dirty fuel to meet our access needs? So that I believe that this is going to be an issue that will come up. But just to finish it off, in addition to carbon trading, there are other innovative ways of generating carbon credits. One of them is what is referred to as regenerative agriculture, or what they call carbon farming. This could be an additional source of climate finance. In fact, India has recently established a market for carbon credits for its farmers. And I believe that Africa can learn lessons from India. And in addition to carbon farming, there are other technologies such as improved cook stoves, biogas digesters, and solar household solar systems, which could be targeted by crediting systems to generate carbon credits. So I think that in the case of Africa, there are good prospects of raising the incomes of farmers and raising the incomes of households by looking at some of these innovative tools. So to conclude, the first point is that Africa has received relatively little climate finance, especially for adaptation. And this has led to communities finding challenges to adapt to climate change. Also, due to lack of technical expertise, many countries are not able to develop bankable projects to attract increased climate finance. And I've shown that the cost of inaction on climate finance has actually contributed to the loss of lives and livelihoods on the continent. And as I said before, the Russia-Ukraine war is exerting pressure on countries around the world. And my fear is that these pressures might lead to them reneging on their pledges that they've made, and even in terms of their own commitments to the NDCs. And I believe that this is an issue that needs to be addressed seriously at COP27. And I think there's an opportunity for Africa to present a very strong case for the three issues that I outlined. One is the climate finance. Two is the issue of the just energy transition. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'll hand over back to Belinda for questions and comments.